Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, another week with all the latest on BC politics, the ins and outs of everything happening with the legislature back for the fall sitting, although I have to say week one, a bit of a dud. We're going to get into that as our first, one of our first topics here later in the show. I want to bring in the panel first because we got a lot to get to. First, starting with Jillian Oliver, Green Strategist Extraordinaire. You see her every week. Hello, Jillian. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me back.
Katy Merrifield, Vice President, Wellington Advocacy. We missed you last week. Thanks for being back.
You're very welcome.
And Maclean Kay, editor of The Orca. Hello, Maclean.
Happy and even excited to be here.
Well, somebody has enthusiasm. I like it.
It's me.
It's you. That means you get the first question then. Way to
go.
go. Talked yourself into that. The first topic we're going to talk about here, and I guess, Maclean, you know, as someone with a kid in school right now, we were going to go to you first on this anyways, but the issue of mandatory vaccines in schools has dominated BC politics for this week. We have ended up at the end of the week with a government approach that appears to be punting it off to 60 different school districts to decide 60 different times whether or not to make vaccines mandatory for teachers and school staff. That appears to be the government's position at the end of a week in which this was debated in the House and in public, and Premier John Horgan took a bunch of questions of it. I don't know what that does for anxiety amongst parents who are watching cases go up amongst school-age kids, Maclean, but what do you make of where we're at here now?
I mean, the province has settled on what they think is the path of least resistance. They don't want to be the ones telling, teachers union or anyone else who doesn't want to get vaccinated that they're the ones saying they have to. They're saying, well, technically, the employers are the local school boards, and you mentioned there are 60 of them across the province. And what this would do is punt this decision to locally elected people. Again, 60 groups across the province who'd probably be much more subject to local pressures and things like that. And we would end up with what's being called a patchwork of vaccine requirements and mandates. This is crazy. I mean, you mentioned I'm a parent. I have a kid here in school in Victoria, and they would likely, I think, be ones that would support a vaccine mandate, but that isn't necessarily true in places across the province. And it's ludicrous that, my kid would have teachers in that had a different vaccine mandate than a kid in Nanaimo, Pouce Coupe, Dawson Creek, Vancouver, Surrey. It's crazy. There's no reason this decision can't be made at the provincial level.
It's Pouce Coupe, right? Not Pouce Coupe? I always wondered about that.
Is it really? Okay,
I have no idea.
I thought it was Pouce Coupe.
Okay, well, readers, if you're hearing this, email us and tell us which one it is. Good points. Jillian, as our self-appointed rural correspondent for the show, how do you think this is going to go over? My question to the Premier this week is, aren't you leaving the districts that need vaccine mandates the most in the lurch here without leadership? But I don't know if it's going to be quite as bad as it might look from the outside. What do you think?
Totally. I think that's one of the biggest problems with this approach. I think the districts where it's most needed will be the least likely to implement it and be subject to a lot of local pressure. I think there's other issues like in places like Vancouver where you might have part-time teachers that go between different school districts subject to different rules, independent schools not being subject to anything potentially. Yeah, it's a mess. And I think the other thing too is that, the NDP said that they wanted a provincial election last year to get politics out of the way to make the hard decisions that are needed on COVID. And now they're just tossing this into the lap of school boards who have an election next year. So not only are the school boards that are in these kind of, more resistant communities going to be facing a lot of pressure, it's going to be under, really intense political conditions for them.
Yeah, and school boards, you got to sympathize with them because they were told throughout this pandemic, shut up and do what you're told. When Dr. Henry tells you about cohorts and masks and your ability to not do rapid testing and all these things that they maybe wanted to do, and they were said, you follow the expert science from Dr. Henry. And now on vaccines, they're getting told, well, you figure it out. And John Horgan's comment was, why don't school trustees do their jobs and educate themselves about vaccines? And you're like, what? How is that going to help anybody?
Stay rude.
Yeah, in this day and age. Katy, there's lots of moving dynamics here. You have the teachers union, you got politics all over the place. What do you make of where we ended up?
Well, I think this is really fascinating because if you look at some recent public polling that's been done, almost 70% of parents want to see both mandatory vaccinations and masks in school for staff and visitors at a minimum. BC also outstrips the national average in terms of vaccinating eligible students at about 58% support. So like with all of this, it seems like a no-brainer that the government would implement a universal mandate. I will say, like, one defense point for the government, I guess, like, no, it doesn't appear that any other province has enforced a universal mandate, with many have chosen to defer this to the school boards. However, this is a little bit convenient. And I think the minister's public defense of the strategy, that they lack a public health order, is a little bit vexing. Dr. Henry has said there's not enough transmissions in schools to justify this. It wouldn't survive a legal challenge. However, I'll remind folks that the government and Dr. Henry were not so concerned with legal ramifications when they imposed a universal vaccine passport just a month or so ago for all non-essential businesses, with absolutely no exemptions, even for medical concerns. So it seems a little bit curious to me.
Yeah, it feels like Dr. Henry got caught last week with her data presentation, which was supposed to reassure parents that there wasn't widespread transmission in schools. She spent a lot of time explaining that to everybody. And then suddenly parents and teachers were like, well, of course it is. My kid goes to school. They got dirty little hands. They're picking their nose. They're going to spread the COVIDs everywhere. How is there no data? And she got stuck on that. And I think there's new modeling coming out next week, maybe the week after, where she might reevaluate that position, because, Katy, you're right. The easiest way to do this is a public health order from Dr. Henry rather than 60 different things. But she says that the science doesn't support it. So I guess we'll have to roll with that for now. But man, this is going to be messy. Like, can you imagine the school board meetings in Dawson Creek or in Peace River South, where you're going to have less than 60% of the population is fully vaccinated? And like, what are those meetings going to be like with those poor trustees and anti-vax delegates lined up to speak outside the meeting room? It's going to be a nightmare. So we'll keep an eye on that. Let's move on to the legislature session, which we're now 1 week into. Not super impressive. I didn't really see a lot there, but we can go around and just kind of talk about if anything jumped out at you, if you think people are paying attention, if there was anything do we need a warm-up week when legislature sessions start, where everyone just kind of finds the washrooms again and that's how we do it? I don't know, but this was a week in which 87 MLAs were able to come back in person for the first time. So there was that, but we didn't get necessarily a lot of work done. Let's go around in the other order, Katy.
I liked the BC Liberal strategy for this week. They went out after the deaths resultant from the heat dome. They went after overdoses. The reason that I like this strategy, the reason I think it's politically intelligent, is because governments on the center left usually get almost a free pass on anything that's seen as like compassion and concern, taking care of the most vulnerable. And so for them to hit on the fact that an unprecedented number of people in this province continue to die as a result of an overdose crisis that they promised to fix, not to mention that the travesty that occurred this summer, I think that is smart to keep hammering it home. And I think it worked, because Horgan was absent for 2 days, and I don't think that was an accident.
Yeah, well, let's pick up on that then. Jillian, you've helped with crafting, kind of question period questions before. When the Liberals are choosing to go on overdose deaths and the heat dome, and the Premier's not there, and they're talking to an empty chair, what are the pros and cons of that? Is it good or bad? Does it accomplish something? Adrian Dix ran the clock out for 2 question periods on those subjects. What do we make of it, do you think?
I think that kind of to your opening point, I don't think a lot of people are paying attention. So I don't think that there's a huge cost to the government for keeping the Premier out of the chamber at the outset. It gives them time to kind of hear how the opposition is framing the questions and to sort of better prep the Premier, because his responses are going to be elevated in a way that other ministers aren't. There was like some news hits out of this question period strategy. I think it's a great strategy, and I think they should stick with it. I think this is the biggest underreported story of the year, maybe even in many years in BC. Are the deaths from this heat dome in BC are astronomical compared to Washington State and Oregon that had very similar conditions. So I think it's a really good strategy, but they're going to have to keep hitting on it to make it stick to the Premier.
Mm-hmm. Maclean, what did you make of it? And I thought another interesting strategy from the Liberals was to have Jackie Teegert come out and talk about 90 some odd days since Lytton was ravaged by fire. A very emotional discussion of people in the community who are still wondering what the heck is going on from government. That seemed to land well too. What did you make of everything?
I mean, there's no better story you can tell than one that's directly personal. And you mentioned Jackie Taggart. She prefaced her question period line of questioning with a 2-minute statement in which she was visibly emotional, and that was sort of powerful because it meant that it made her sort of unheckleable, if that makes sense. And she was talking about people she knows, her constituents, who I guess if the question period was yesterday, today would be 100 days since Lytton burned down, and they've been, living out of hotels, eating restaurants, and not knowing where or when they're going to be going next. The province, the provincial government, the premier told them that they'd have their backs, but it's been 100 days. That's an astronomically long time to be sitting in a hotel room wondering, where you're going to be spending the rest of your life. And so, yeah, it's the question period tactics work best when there are concrete cases you can put a face on. It's not statistics, it's not numbers. It's, this person whose name is this happened to them. When are you going to help them? Those are very powerful questions, and they're hard to deflect.
Yeah, there were good question periods, but let's back up and talk about the session, I guess. So a week in, it's a gigantic nothing burger of a session so far, and we sometimes, start navel gazing about whether we need fall sessions. Should the legislature be in session even if there's no agenda from the government or there's accountability and questions? If that happens, who's watching? Who cares? What does anything get done? We sort of look like maybe we're in that position here. There certainly wasn't any interesting bills. There was a bill about trampoline park safety, which is important, but I guess that wasn't the robust agenda the premier promised. So how do we frame for the public the risks and the rewards and the ups and downs and the pros and cons of the legislature being in session when there's nothing going on? It seems like it's a risky time for government in general, but Jillian, how do we sort of analyze that from a kind of political point of view?
Well, I think one thing is that this is a pretty typical pace for the NDP government. They usually start the session slow, and then there's a huge rush of bills at the end. There are a couple of big pieces of legislation that we think are coming. The premier hinted about some major environmental legislation that's going to be coming down the pipe that they're putting the finishing touches on. There's also, I think, the bubble exclusion zone legislation, some other stuff that is like definitely in the public interest. I think though that, if that there is value to having more accountability, having ministers present in the House, being able to be questioned by the opposition. And, if they feel like their agenda is thin and they're wasting time talking about the throne speech that was from last year or whatever, they can always make more time for opposition members. There's a bunch of opposition bills on the order papers that could be debated. There's lots of ways to use MLA's time more productively that we're not doing.
Katy, you've helped strategize a couple premiers, and you must look at question periods where there's no agenda, nothing going on, as gigantic risks to those premiers because, what are they talking about? What are any of us talking about? It's just a blank piece of paper that comes at them every single day. What is that like?
Well, I have a pretty profound take on question period. So gather around and listen up, everybody.
Turn your volume up, everyone.
Turn your volume up. My take is no one cares.
Aww.
And I know that sounds cynical. However, what I'm saying, I'm not hating on the BC legislature or any legislature. I'm not hating on parliamentary democracy, although I have been accused of that. What I'm saying that we live in a new media environment where tweets drive more headlines than when a bill becomes law sometimes. And so this theater and the pomp and circumstance of question period is not as relevant as it once was. Like back in the day, young kids, back in the mid to late 2000s,
right.
Question period was extremely relevant. It used to drive the 6 o'clock news, and that's where everyone got their current events. That is not the environment that we live in anymore. So I think that per Jillian's point from a few questions ago, we're really focused in on the strategy and what transpires and who won. But Joe Public is not. I would love to know how many people tune in to QP either as it's happening or check it out later on. So that's my cynical, angry old cow take on QP. On the legislative session itself, this is the beauty of our Westminster system. Of course, Parliament should be in session both fall and spring, and that's why they get voted into office. However, I will say in BC in particular, fall sessions are mostly housekeeping. Spring sessions are where the budget comes in, the throne speech, and it's more of an exciting time. Fall is typically reserved for bill cleanup. And I do have to say, like, under Gordon Campbell, I don't think we actually ever sat in the fall. I think there was maybe one or two, but anyways, no, like, politicians should be in the House doing their job. However, there are other ways to get things done, especially in this province via OCs and whatnot.
Yeah, well, that's true. Well, John Horgan, as opposition leader, used to say at every fall session that Christy Clark didn't hold, what a wasted opportunity it was, and we should be here every single day if we can. This is the people's house doing the people's business. What else are we doing? We should run this place 24/7. Now he doesn't show up half the week to question period. I think we're all fated to become the things we hate the longer we stay in politics. But yeah, Katy.
Yeah. That is such an important point. Like, Premier Horgan missed 2 QPs from the first week. Like, there's a big argument that is disrespectful to the parliamentary process. It is disrespectful to Her Majesty's loyal opposition. But will he get criticized for it? Probably not. Maybe a day.
Because
it's not going to stick.
But because, as you point out, no one's watching. So who cares if he comes to question period then?
But it's also fascinating because I can tell you, if Premier Kenney missed 1 QP a week, he was absolutely roasted for hiding, like, for disrespecting our democratic institutions, like, which that takes ridiculous to new heights, because that man loves parliamentary process more than any living or dead politician in the Westminster system.
But Christy Clark used to make the argument, and fair enough, I think the NDP would quietly agree with this, that the Premier's got more important things to do sometimes than sitting in the House, fobbing all the questions off to somebody else, taking the first one and then sitting there quietly while the Minister of Mental Health gets blasted for 3/4 of a question period. She didn't think that was a good use of time. Horgan doesn't appear to think that's a great use of time. I don't know. Maybe that's just a Premier's prerogative to hate that venue. I don't know. Maclean, you watched some of it this week. What did you think?
I mean, there's a lot we could touch on here. With Horgan missing 2 question periods, look, is as skilled a debater as he is, and he is a very skilled debater, in the last few months he's had a habit of kind of putting his foot in it. And so, especially with very sensitive topics, one of the main issues of question period this week was Horgan's comments about the heat dome. Fatalities are a part of life, and there's an element of personal responsibility here. The fact that we were debating, or that the legislature was debating things he said, yeah, you could argue maybe him being there, not being there, was a good tactic. All of Jillian's and Katy's points about session in general and the fall session are all well taken. And the only thing I would add is this. The NDP were very clear that there was, I think their word was, a robust legislative agenda coming this fall. That may well be the case, but it certainly wasn't the case in the first week. The fact that they spent hours debating a throne speech from, is it April? These are all long pre-written speeches that some poor staffer in the basement is working overnight to talk about why the government is great or why the government is terrible, depending on which side they're on in the House. And it is a giant waste of time. I would suggest that on days like that, look, if there's no reason for the House to be sitting, then you can close early. We can still have session. I'm not saying everyone goes home, but maybe the House closes that day at 3 rather than 6. Yeah. And the legislative session is important for question period, for passing bills, but other functions of the legislature, like committees, those go on whether the House is sitting or not. So it's not like, the politicians all just go to the bar afterwards.
No, that's the reporters. But
yes.
Jillian, last word to you on this. You had a good comment the other week when we talked about Justin Trudeau taking a walk on the beach in Tofino during National Truth and Reconciliation Day. Well, clearly he's not running again. Do we think Horgan might be different in this session, maybe doesn't show up or changes things because there's a question about whether he runs again?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It kind of seems like that people have been talking a lot more openly about that with the Prime Minister than they have with Horgan, where it's sort of just been rumored. And I think that he has maybe more reason, bigger caucus to manage, to try to keep together, to kind of keep up appearances until he makes the call on that. But we shall see.
Yeah,
it's
an open thing to keep in mind as we watch the session. If we get a sense that that he's done, maybe he doesn't need to do these kind of things anymore. He's just doesn't have to go back to the electorate. So his brand is a little bit less important. We don't know. But let's move on to I think what we've all been waiting for here, the most important topic of this week, which is our hot take on Thanksgiving is coming up. You're going to gather with your family and friends for dinner somewhere. And the question is, pumpkin pie or apple pie? Maclean?
You're both wrong. It's any kind of berry pie is the superior pie.
Oh.
But if that is the only choice, the fruit pie, greater than sign, pumpkin pie.
Yeah. Really? Well, what? Okay. All right. Well, we'll open it up to any pie. What's your Thanksgiving dessert then, Jillian?
I'm going pumpkin. It's the most festive by far. It just fits. It's the right thing to do.
And you can only really eat it at this time of year, right? Like, no one's eating pumpkin pie at Easter. It looks weird. So you get it once a year. You eat it now. It's good. It's good. Katy?
Correct. Yeah.
I am wrapping up a Whole30. It's an elimination diet. So I'm having a gluten-free, dairy-free pumpkin pie this year because my friend Carly is a culinary wizard.
Gluten-free,
dairy-free, yes. No one has suffered like I have suffered.
Is it just like a meringue on a plate or something? And it's just.
We'll have to see.
Is it a picture of a pumpkin pie on a plate, and then you just kind of?
It's just the scent of pumpkin. You just waft it.
Can I change my answer because pumpkin pie is better than whatever Katy's eating?
That's right. Yeah. You have 2 pumpkin pies, and then I, who took a lot of flack for my choices at the Mike Check fast food roundtable, which I encourage you to listen to, I will choose veggie sub from Subway. That's the best dessert for Thanksgiving.
I want a podcast about your choices in life, Rob.
Well, that would be a very long podcast, very depressing long podcast, but nonetheless, veggie sub for dessert on Thanksgiving is delicious. I will go with pumpkin pie. I like it. I like the pumpkin spice latte. I like the pumpkins. Pumpkins are good. Pumpkin seeds that are roasted. I don't know. I'm a fall guy. I really like the fall. So
basic B.
All right. Terrific. That's one way to put it. We'll let our older listeners Google that term. Well, we thank them.
Katy's last show.
We thank everyone for listening. Make sure you subscribe. We'll be back next week. Next week is a break week, so we won't have to talk about the legislative session. We can talk about other things that are going on, how everybody's Thanksgiving went, Katy's pumpkin pie, and everything like that. Thank you for listening and subscribing, and we will talk to you next week.